Hi everyone, my name's Andrew McGregor. I'm in the discipline of Geography and Planning at the Macquarie School of Social Sciences at Macquarie University, which is in Sydney, Australia. I'm going to be on the activity lead for Activity 5, which is learning from local agricultural success, and it's obviously part of the bigger project of next generation agricultural extension, and we're focusing in on social relations for practice change. My career has been mainly focusing on human-environment relations, particularly looking at development issues in Southeast Asia, but also increasingly looking at some of the issues in Australia. Within Southeast Asia, I've been looking at the power and influence of different actors within the aid industry and how they affect local social environmental interactions. My most recent research focuses on the social dimensions of climate mitigation programs, particularly as they relate to forests and agriculture. So I'm really excited to be part of this project. I'm very thankful for the support we've received from ACIAR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Also very thankful that we've managed to pull together such a wonderful team of people. There's a list of partner institutions there. You can see it's an extensive group of people with plenty of skills and knowledge and expertise in agriculture in Cambodia, where this project is based. Okay, so for my talk, I'm going to be focusing upon Activity 5, which is looking at local agricultural success and the lessons we can learn from local success. So I'm going to go through, first of all, the research aim. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the conceptual approach, because I guess it's a slightly unusual conceptual approach, so it's worth spending a bit of time on that. Then I'll briefly go through the methodological approach, so the types of methods we'll be using to explore this research question, and then briefly review each of 6 research questions before a summary to finalise the talk. So I'll get straight into it. So this is the question that we're asking. We're looking at, or this is the theme we're exploring, learning from local agricultural success. So the aim of this activity is to learn from farmers about how agricultural transitions occur and what contributes to agricultural success in the case study villages. So rather than see current farming practices as somehow deficient or not working in particularly good ways, we recognise that there are different approaches from different farmers within the villages in which we're going to be focusing upon, some of which are more successful than others. So more successful, possibly more sustainable than others, but that's not necessarily tied together. So the aim of our activity is to learn from these more successful farmers. How have they become successful? What has enabled them to become successful? And what barriers have they had to overcome to get to the position they're in now? So it's very much about identifying the strengths of the communities in order to inform interventions that build upon the particularities of the local context, and to ensure that what we propose through this project is going to be locally relevant and hopefully successful as well. So there's 6 components of this particular activity. First of all, and this is a very important component, is understanding how local communities actually perceive agricultural success. So how they perceive success may be different from someone who's outside the community who might have particular ideas of what success looks like. So it's very important that we understand how local people perceive success. We then look at what relations, so what social relations, but also what material relations, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, enable agricultural success in the local context. So how do different relations contribute to success? And then what does agricultural success look like in practice? So what is the work that goes into maintaining success? How do household demographics influence success? So how do different household members contribute to success, but also what are the barriers and access issues that different demographics face in terms of trying to improve the agricultural practices? What material conditions shape success? So access to equipment, the types of fields or soils they may have, how that influences success. And then what types of actors have the greatest influence on farmer decisions to undertake practice change? And that includes traditional forms of agricultural extension, but also includes many other actors, human and non-human, that might be influencing why a farmer changes their practices. Now that could be government, it could be neighbours, for example, encouraging people to change or exchanging information that leads a farmer to change their practices. But it could also be something like a flood or a storm event that ruins a particular crop, and I think, oh, I'm going to try something new as a result of that adverse impact. So understanding the multiple factors that lead to practice change is important, I think, when trying to think about improving agricultural practices and agricultural transitions. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide. So I want to spend a bit of time just talking about the conceptual approach for this particular project, and bear with me, I will be delving into some pretty serious concepts, but at the same time I think that they're important and they can be communicated in a fairly straightforward way. So let's think about this. So the conceptual approach to Activity 5 is broadly informed by grassroots or post-development and community-oriented approaches, where we're really focusing upon what can be learned from local expertise and local experiences. So by doing this, we're resisting like simple hierarchies of knowledge by positioning the farmer as the expert as opposed to someone who may have a long background in agricultural sort of research, for example. So we strongly believe that local communities should be driving decisions about their own futures, and that the role of the outsider is to stimulate, facilitate and assist local communities in their efforts to live well within their local contexts. So it's all about empowering local communities, which has been around in development for a long time now. So our approach is influenced by assets-based community development, or ABCD, which focuses on the strengths rather than the weaknesses of communities. So the emphasis is upon what strengths and assets already exist and how can they be built upon to enable practice change, rather than emphasising what they don't have, what needs and absences they might have. So ABCD in this sense is empowering because it works on what already exists rather than waiting on gaps to be filled. So that's kind of a broader framework for thinking about how we're approaching these sorts of questions. A closely related concept is social capital, which Coleman explains as the direct and indirect resources that are a byproduct of social networks and social support systems amongst family, friends or community members. So one of the assets most people share are the social relations they have with others. So this might be people you can call upon and assist to help with formal or informal work. So you might be doing formal work on the field, or it might be informal work of caring for a child, so a farmer can go and work on the field. Or it can be the help during adverse events, like when there is a flood, or there may be pests on the farm, or something like that. So people can help, whether it's exchanging knowledge, whether it's providing temporary support, whether it's helping on the fields, helping again with childcare or something like that. These are all aspects of social capital that people can draw upon. So to understand success, we are seeking to understand the social relations that enable success and how disabling social relations, those that might prevent people from moving forward, such as exploitative financing arrangements, for example, and debt, can be avoided. So that's our sort of broad overview of approaches. We're trying to empower the local, understand the local, and build from local strengths and assets. To this social analysis, we also bring interest in the material world. So we're drawing on concepts like relationality, more than human, and assemblage thinking. These are the broad concepts I mentioned before, which are quite complex, but at the same time are quite useful. So what each of these concepts does is make the material world, so the physical worlds in which we live in, so the trees and the fields and the weather, the rocks, all these sorts of things, the worms, brings these physical worlds to the forefront of analysis. So rather than being an inert sort of backdrop in which humans impose themselves, which is kind of one of the traditional ways of thinking about the material world, we recognise that non-human actors shape decisions and practices as much as, or often more than, purely social relations. So how we behave on an everyday basis is shaped very much by the material world. For example, today it's raining, which is going to affect my whole day in terms of how I spend my day. So if anyone knows this, it is farmers. So this is not news to farmers. They are continually responding to changes and signals from soils, rains, pests and diseases. These are communicating to farmers who then make decisions on how they're going to respond. So these non-human actors are shaping farmer decision-making as much as or more than the social information and the social worlds that they are involved in. So this is called relational thinking, and relational thinking emphasizes how each of us is entangled in multiple relations with other humans as well as non-humans. So the capacity of an individual to act is dependent on the relations in which the individual is based. So the relations that surround us determine what we can and can't do. As an example, here I am, I'm at home, I'm making this recording at the moment, and that's due to the social relations I have with my partner and my children and my colleagues that enable me to be here at this particular moment, and my kids not to be here and my partner not to be here, so I can make this recording in silence, in quietness around me. And that's enabled me to be here. But there's also material relations that have enabled this recording to happen. The computer itself, which I'm recording upon. The electricity generators that are providing electricity for this computer to operate. The university policies that allow me to work from home. The food I had for breakfast. All these things have contributed to me being in this particular moment. And what I'm doing is managing these different relations to enable me to act in this particular way. On the other hand, I can't go up to the shops and stack shelves in the local supermarket. Nor can I put on a police uniform and suddenly police the streets with a gun in my pocket. As an individual, I could physically do it, but I don't have the social and material relations that enable me to do it. So I'm not able to do those sorts of things. Instead, my material and social relations allow me to do university research, which is this particular recording I'm doing now. So in a very similar way, farmers are bound up in enabling and disabling relations that shape what they can and can't do. And that is really the approach we're taking in this activity, understanding these relations that are shaping what farmers can and can't do, in the same way that you sitting there are bound up in relations which shape what you can and can't do. So the relations that bound particular things together within society are sometimes referred to as assemblages. So assemblages capture the multitude of human and non-human relations that give form to the world today. So we can think of cities as a large assemblage, or university as an assemblage, or communities of practice as being assemblages as well. Importantly, assemblages are always in the making. They're never fixed, they're never the same. Instead, work is required to keep the assemblage together. So in this project, we approach farms as complex assemblages, involving human and non-human relations, which enable farmers to grow crops or raise animals, whatever they may be whatever they might be prioritizing at that time. So some of the social relations you can see on the screen here are things like the family relations, childcare, remittances, relations with lenders, employers, buyers, authorities, agricultural businesses, extension agents, etc. On the other hand, there's material relations that they're also bound up in, such as soils, pests, weeds, seeds, fields, machinery, equipment, roads, winds, rains, floods, access to the internet, all sorts of different things that shape how our farmer can act. So what you can see is we've moved away from the individual, thinking of the individual as a sort of isolated decision maker, to instead focus on a broader way of framing and understanding how individual decisions are made by the multiple relations in which people are embedded. So successful farmers are managing multiple relations to bring about positive outcomes. Our question focuses on these more successful farmers by asking them a simple question: how do they do that? What sort of relations are contributing to their success? And what can be learned from these farmers to inform practices elsewhere? So that's our relational approach. We're taking a grassroots relational approach to understanding success in this particular context. Hope that wasn't too much, and I hope you get the basic principles of what we're trying to do. So what that requires is a particular methodological approach. So our methodology is framed by our overall conceptual framework, and which approaches farms as assemblages and farmers as actors within complex systems of human and non-human relations. So to unpack these assemblages and trace the enabling and excuse me, just looking at the time there, to unpack these assemblies and trace the enabling and disabling relations that influence success, Activity 5 focuses on 50 households that are locally defined as agriculturally successful. Our simple question is why? What has enabled them to be successful? And we answer this by tracking the relations in which they are embedded. This requires a range of mostly qualitative research techniques to really understand how and why these households have been successful. We will work closely with our partners in Cambodia to implement the methods, some of which involve staying within the case study villages for short periods of time. I should also note that many of these themes, and indeed the selection of households, will be explored as components of previous activities as well. So this work will build upon and be shared by the findings of earlier activities. The key methods we anticipate using at this point, and we may still modify these as earlier activities take place, include in-depth interviews with successful households, so group and individual interviews, oral histories tracing key events that have contributed to their success, participant observation, where researchers work on fields but also accompany household members where permitted during other activities such as travelling to markets, accessing education or childcare, visits to suppliers, all sorts of relations that may have some influence upon farm activities. So these social activities enable farming to take place in particular ways, and so we consider them part of the farm assemblage. Social network analysis, so part of the research will focus on identifying and mapping the social networks that enable the farm to function. We'll also seek to identify both enabling and disabling relations and the strategies adopted to maximise beneficial relations and avoid negative ones. So, for example, cultivating relations with agricultural suppliers and avoiding relations with unfair traders. We'll also look at more than human research methods, which I'll talk more about in a few slides. But we're going to try and innovate here by mapping the key material relations alongside the social networks that farmers are embedded within. So those sorts of material relations I'm talking about are relations with fertilisers or soils or weather that farmers identify as having particular impacts on their practice. And then we'll analyse these things using standard qualitative data analysis techniques as well as some social and material network analysis techniques. Okay, so that's the broad, so we're going to use different elements of this range of methods for the 6 questions that I'm going to go through now. I'll go through these questions fairly quickly so you can get a feel of what we're doing. Okay, so first of all, the first question asks, how do local communities perceive success? So this is very much in line with our community-oriented approach in which we should not presume what success looks like. Understanding how communities define success is essential if agricultural extension programs are going to be locally useful and locally valued. So, local definitions of success may be associated with many different things such as wealth, productivity, assets, well-being, family, lifestyle, or a range of other issues, and are likely to differ between demographic groups. So we want to understand local definitions of success and how those definitions might vary amongst different demographic groups. Much of this will be determined through earlier activities, particularly Activity 4, but also the household census and the field surveys. So drawing on data from the earlier activities, we'll also identify the 50 households that are locally, up to 50 households, that are locally associated with success for further analysis. So we're going to identify within the previous activities what 50 households are most associated with success, and then we're going to drill down. We're going to dive into these households and really try and understand what has made them successful through this more relational approach. So our second question then focuses on the social and material relations that have enabled these 50 households to achieve what is locally considered to be successful. There's 3 types of relations that we're focused upon. The first is historical. So what historical moments may have assisted a household to get ahead? So it might have been a good season, might have been a shift in practice where they shifted crops, or they had access to new equipment perhaps, or a boost in income which has come through remittances or something like that. So you want to understand, the history of the household. What moments have led the household to suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, but maybe even gradually, or just sustaining success over a long period of time. What has enabled the household to get ahead? And we want to sort of map out a timeline for each of these households, trying to understand key moments. Then we want to look at what social relations have contributed to agricultural success, so relationships with authorities, for example, with children through remittance flows or other family members who may be sending back remittances, relations with microfinance lenders, relations with caring institutions or caring practices, and then what material relations have contributed to agricultural success, such as crops, what type of crops they use, the seeds they use, the pesticides they use, access to land, access to equipment, all these sorts of things. So what we're hoping to do then, through the techniques and the methods I mentioned before, such as participant observation, interviews, social network analysis, and more than human research techniques, is produce timelines for each household and network maps that map out the particular relations that seem to be contributing to success for those households. Okay, and then in question 3, we say we look at success not as something that just happens, but something that is practiced and pursued on an everyday basis. So the farm is seen as always changing, and it's reliant on practices on and off the farm to maintain desirable outputs. This requires ongoing efforts, and these efforts are both labour and innovations in the field, but also labour and efforts off the field, whether it's going to markets, finding childcare, getting advice from neighbours. All these efforts are part of what we consider the farm assemblage. So we aim to track these practices, which in a sense is looking at the relations identified in the previous question and seeing how they are put to use in an everyday way. So what practices and strategies do successful households draw upon? Participant observation will play a big role in this component, as well as interviews and transect walks. Okay, so question 4 then looks at household demographics. So we look at the unevenness in terms of access to beneficial relations and avoiding negative ones. So different types of people have different access to different things. Again, we're focusing on successful households, but we take a clear look at the demographic makeup of those households and whether they differ from the broader makeup in the village as identified from the household census. We then delve beneath the surface of the household to look at how intra-household demographics affects access to different sorts of relations. So, for example, do women and men have access to different markets or opportunities? Do young or old people face different sorts of barriers from each other? How are younger and older parents, including single-parent households, affected, enabled or disabled by their children in forming particular relations and so on? Most of this data will come from interviews with household members. So we're sort of, we're drilling down beneath the level of the household to understand the different sorts of relations that men and women have, that older and younger people have, that parents have and non-parents have. So what gives them access to beneficial relations, what helps sustain beneficial relations, and what detracts from it, what barriers do particular groups experience because of demographic variables. And that can help us think through strategies to overcome those barriers and also provide more households with access to beneficial relations. So that's going to inform some of the strategy that goes into activity 6. Okay, so that's question 4. Question 5, we're asking how do material relations shape success? And obviously this is relates to question 2 of this approach as well, where we're mapping the material and social relations. But we decided to develop a particular question that emphasises material relations to make sure it stays at the fore of this component of the research. Here we are explicitly interested in the non-human, the seeds, the soils, equipment and roads that influence how success is experienced and understood. In this sense, we see material relations in much the same way as social relations, as networks of actors influencing what can and can't be done. Clearly, if someone has access to a tractor or a truck, they have different capacities to act than someone who doesn't. Similarly, being close to a water source may have a large bearing on success. One of the interesting ways we will approach this aspect of the project will be drawing on more than human research methods. And I've been fortunate enough to work with one of my ex-PhD students who's now a lecturer at the University of Otago in New Zealand, Dr. Ash Alam, who's done some excellent work in this space. His work on photo response is extremely innovative. He gives farmers cameras where they take photos of their daily practice and the things that are important to them, which then form the basis for subsequent discussions and maps. You can see an example here that attempts to spatially and visually represent non-human relations. And we're going to draw on this type of methodology for this aspect of the project. What you can see here is the household in the middle, And then the farmers have taken photos of the various things that are important to their farming practices or their daily lives, and we sort of spatially place them around the household, so you can understand where these material relations, or we can visually see the material things that are important to them, but also the spatial location. So if we can do this and combine it with social network analysis, we're going to have very comprehensive understanding of the different relations that influence how these households act. In identifying the non-human relations that contribute to success for successful farmers, we can seek to replicate these in other areas. And that brings me on to the last question for this aspect of the project, which is what types of actors have the greatest influence on farmer decisions to undertake practice change? So how does good practice and good information flow within the community? This will largely be done through interviews and through discussions of the social and material networks that are developed. So we'll explore both social actors, governments, businesses, markets, neighbours, and material actors, so seasons, soils and floods, that trigger practice change. We'll also explore how and whether successful farmers are agents of change themselves. So this is really trying to understand, once we get an understanding of the sorts of desirable relations that are out there, how farmers are accessing that and practicing those desirable outcomes, what are the best ways to try and transfer this knowledge or extend this knowledge throughout their communities. And our findings from this activity will be very important for building strategies to encourage change or encourage success in other households through activity 6. Okay, so that's the last question, and then I'm just going to wrap up here. So hopefully you've got a bit of an understanding of what we're trying to do in this activity. We're really trying to understand success. We're trying to learn from local farmers. We're taking a relational approach, trying to understand the social and material relations that contribute to success, how that's practiced on a daily basis, and then how that can be, how that differs for different demographic groups, and then how we can communicate this to other groups within the case study areas. So it's providing some groundwork that really builds from success within the local village, which we can then take to analyse and develop strategies for the interventions that will be associated with this particular project, which we can then report on, and hopefully we'll develop some really interesting ideas and approaches and methods that can inform agricultural extension and agricultural development in other places. So that's pretty much from me. I hope you found this aspect of the project informative and interesting. I'm certainly looking forward to beginning this component of the project. I also welcome any suggestions or feedback that you may have. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen to me. It's got a bit longer than I thought it would, but that's it from me. Thank you.